what we're going to be mainly looking at is this model here, as well as a couple of previews that I have prepared for you over here, right? Where I'm going to diagnose some of my older drawings for mistakes as well. So let's head to that a little bit later on, but first let's talk about some of the common mistakes we'll be going from head to toe. So I think that will be a pretty good order in which to do things. So firstly, I would say a common mistake that beginners tend to make, especially at an early stage when you're drawing the character's head, is that you kind of misplace the neck. So when we're drawing a character's head tilted this way, right, it's easy to go like, okay, character's head is this way. Let me just kind of work with this a bit. So it'd be like, okay, so the neck comes straight down like this, right? Like, or if you're very much used to drawing portraits, our head is anchored this way, and then we'll start extending the lines out from the head, right? And this is somewhat related to what I mentioned before, which is, right, posing in isolation, kind of, and as well as isolated focus on individual body part. So if you were to do something like this, it's like, okay, so let me just draw it like this. It should look something like this, right? And the reality is that it could work most of the time, but sometimes what happens here is that you create a bit of a strange scenario where your head is so no longer located on the center line of the body. So that could be something that's a little bit difficult to notice right off the bat because, you know, the lines kind of flow correctly, right? There's no real immediately obvious issue until you keep wondering, why does the pose look a bit weird? Why does the shoulders look a bit weird? So one of the key aspects is at the neck here, where you want to really be careful on where you want to place it. Make sure after drawing the torso, kind of make sure you indicate the middle, right? Keep the median line really accurate, and then grow the neck from here, rather than draw the head first and then grow it down. I think this will help you a lot when it comes to placing the head of your character, right? Especially when you're drawing a standing pose. And this goes for the same. Let me use a bit of a finer pen. This absolutely goes the same for if you're drawing a lying down pose or a running pose. Every other pose, this is going to be even more sensitive. I think that's a good word. So speaking of the neck region, another issue we can have if we want to go over here is that it's possible that sometimes the neck is placed a little too short, right? Like something like this, right? It's not too common, but it happens. So one other thing you want to make sure of is neck length. So let me write here first, right? Center neck. Okay, so number 2 is neck length. So the neck length is pretty sensitive as well because it's easy to look like you have too long a neck or too short of a neck. I think what a good way to do things is if you refer back to our proportions video, what I like to do is to sort of isolate the head area up to the waist, which is about 2.5 heads, right, from my usual model. And that gives me a pretty good perception of how things should be because I have a fairly limited range here to work with. I'm not working too broadly. I'm working in this region. I can have a good gauge of how big the torso should be, right? How big the rib cage should be with respect to the skull. And all this kind of lines up a lot more easily than if you were either to focus too big right off the bat, or if you were to focus too closely, like something like this. So having the neck length being something pretty sensitive is, let me demonstrate it here, right? So if we kind of move the character's neck a little bit too short, it can have the effect of the character being a little bit too hunched forward. So if we look at it from the side view, right, the character feels like this, right? The neck feels like this, where from the front view, right, it's very much foreshortened. So this could be an issue because if you're doing this a bit unknowingly, what ends up happening is that rather than looking as if the character is, you know, leaning forwards, what happens is it looks like the character's neck is just really short and she's scrunching her chin down, which again, right, it's a real pose in the real world. I'm not saying that it's not real or we can never do that, but I think the important thing to recognize here is that we want to be careful, that we want to do everything intentionally. So if we want to have a pose that is a bit more neutral, then we have to make sure that we are careful not to make mistakes like this, which can make the neck read a bit differently. Now, in the same vein, if we were to sort of revert this back to its original shape, in the same vein, right, when you're drawing characters' necks like this, you want to be careful not to make them too tall, like too long, right? Like something like this is really obvious, but maybe something just a little bit too tall like this, a little bit too long like this. The issue with that is that it has a bit of a reverse effect. So if we have a face here, and then the character is sort of looking down, right? That was what we had previously, where the neck is going forward a bit too much. Now, what if the character's neck is going like this, right? What if the pose is like this? So this is also a little bit of a problem, because most of the time, if we're in a bit of a relaxed pose, right, our neck doesn't go like oof, like straight down. There's gonna be a little bit of that tilt, right? Especially as it goes towards the back and down. So you have to respect this portion of the pose, of the body, right? So you have to be kind of careful as you create this contour here, right? That the contour kind of goes this way, right? So this is also kind of important. And if your neck is too vertical, what happens is that it reads as if, or rather if your neck is too long, there's a chance that it reads as if the neck is in such a vertical position. It's a little bit unnatural. So usually, right, the neck is something like this, right? There's a very slight forward tilt, very slight. You can see it in the mirror yourself as well. It's a very neutral pose. So, well, generally speaking, our heads are a little bit forward heavy. Sort of, right? You have the jaw in front, you have a lot of your facial features in front. So you can think of it that way, that your neck kind of flows from the spine into something like this. So do be careful. So neck length is something that, you know, goes both ways. So that's something you should be careful of. Now, you know, either when you're scrunching your neck or you're extending your neck too much, these are some issues. I'm writing it in a little bit in short form because it's a bit faster. So the shoulder height is somewhat related to neck length, because once again, if I do a little bit of a demonstration here, if our shoulder height is a little bit too high, right, then naturally if we build everything to flow into it, what happens here is that either that we design the pose to look this way, so the character is raising her shoulder intentionally, in which case we cannot do this, right? This is not correct. In which case, we need to, for example, in this situation, rotate things up to make sure the length of the arm is preserved. So once again, this is not something that is necessarily wrong. If you want to have this sort of pose where like one arm of the character or one shoulder is raised up a bit, that's fine. Now, let's say if you have both shoulders raised up, right? Both shoulders are raised up. And then you kind of have this sort of strange effect where sometimes I observe it in my own old drawings as well as some beginner drawings, where it feels a little bit too scrunched up, right? Too scrunched up. Shoulder height is a bit of a difficult thing here, because if you put it too low, we'll see what happens in a bit. But if you put it too high, you either unintentionally elongate your upper arm or your lower arm, because you're trying to keep these to your proportionate markers, but your shoulder just goes a little bit too high. The length of the arm is a little bit affected as well. So that's one thing to look out for. And I think that is something that we can show in the reverse as well. So if our shoulder is a bit too low, right, I'm going a bit extreme, so it'll be something like this, right? It'll be something like this. So what happens is that this area feels a little bit too thin, because, you know, the lats actually connect in to this rear area here. The back muscles all interact in a pretty substantial way, right? So if you're lowering the shoulder here too much, right, what happens is that it feels as if you're stretching this far away from the body. It doesn't feel quite as connected to the main torso as it should be. Main torso, I'm saying as if there's a secondary torso, but, you know, it feels a bit too dislocated almost. So it's one of those concerns that you should be careful of as well. And at the same time, if you do this, there's a chance that it's a bit difficult to maintain a proper neck length as well. Now, that's not saying that you cannot draw characters like this. I think it's perfectly viable that you want to experiment with proportions. But once again, the point is that when we're drawing this, we want to do it intentionally, right? Let's say, okay, I want my character to look as if they have pretty developed traps, so I'm going to take that into account and draw it as if their shoulders were a bit lower, while taking into account the length of the upper and lower arm, making sure they line up with the basic proportion in other areas. So it makes itself very clear to yourself and the viewer that this is an intentional choice to make the character look, you know, a little bit more muscular in the traps area and all that stuff. So that is something that I think is worth noticing as well, right? Shoulder height is a little bit sensitive. Although the shoulder being something that is very articulatable, it can move up and down in real life. It makes it, to be honest, a bit more forgiving, right? Like, you can justify it being a bit lower, you can justify it being a bit higher. It is a part that can physically be moved. So shoulder height is something not too dangerous, but it's fine. Now, For the final couple of minutes, what I'm going to do is to sort of break down my old character drawing, this is the old one, and kind of illustrate how there are some mistakes that happen in here too. So if we're going to take a red pen and essentially mark myself down, as you can see right here, there's an issue with the knee, right? The knee is sort of just in the way, where I mentioned before, it should be displaced a little bit backwards and outwards, which we can do like this, right? It should be displaced a little bit backwards and outwards, right? Immediately, you can tell that it looks a lot better. Furthermore, there's a bit of a proportion issue with the upper and lower leg. So if we were to just kind of duplicate this and blend this in a bit, right? If we were to adjust it a little bit like this, and then we can allow for this to come up a little bit because of perspective, right? And notice how the taper was a bit weak before, right? If we were to strengthen the taper a little bit for both, right? Similarly for this one, right? Increase the presence of the muscle belly a bit more because these are tighter jeans, right? This is going to make the legs look a lot more expressive or realistic because previously they look kind of stiff. Here it looks a little bit more expressive, and of course, right? Notice the back of the ankle. What's this part called? Oh, the back of the heel, right? You kind of want to make sure it has the right volume. It's not flat down. It has a bit of a volume like this. So it's not perfect, but this is the kind of arrangement or rearrangement I will make. So similarly to this one, right? As you can see, the upper thigh here doesn't really have the volume. It feels like it just drops off straight. Whereas in reality, it should be something like this, right? A little bit more of a taper, right? A little bit more of a taper like so. And then once again, right? Notice that the lower leg is in line here. That's not what we really want. We kind of want to make sure it's underneath, kind of goes under like this, and then back a bit more. So this is sort of the result that you might be wanting to look for, right? And similarly, here's an issue, right, that I mentioned. Notice how the knee is pointing this way, but the foot is pointing elsewhere, right? And if we kind of readjust the foot a little bit, it's a bit tough to adjust in this sort of mode, but this is a very rough adjustment. If we were to adjust it just a little bit, it looks a lot more natural, right? Of course, we could do a lot better if we just really focused in on it a bit more, right? If we were to do something like this, right, it will look a lot more natural than whatever we had before, which was this. Now, of course, you could say, let's say we want to point the leg outwards like this. We want to twist the entire leg outwards such that the knee is pointing this way and the foot is pointing this way. That's fine as well. So in this case, what we would do is to make sure that the taper also follows that rule as well, right? Something like this, and then we have to make sure the knee still goes under like so, right? Make sure the contours do fit a frontal position, because at the frontal position, right, this muscle belly here and this muscle belly here is going to be visible. And then, right, this works a little bit better than before, as you can see, right? If we rotate the knee this way to fit the foot, it can also work, but you know, you'll stretch out your pants just a little bit more, and that's that. So these are some areas that you can see in my old drawings where the practical part of what I said comes true, where previously we had this very flat thing, but if we kind of do this and do this, right, we add a lot more life to it. And this is something that's important. Similarly to the chest area, right, where we just kind of made the waist a little bit too thick, something like this could really help quite a bit, right? Something like this could help quite a bit. So very basic things like this can help a lot in your drawing to correct mistakes. For example, the legs are too big, you shrink them out a bit. If the shoulder, as I mentioned before, is a little bit too thin, we can buff that up a bit more. Make sure the taper is in. As you can see, that there wasn't much of a taper here. Now that the taper is in, that's quite a lot of difference, right? Suddenly this character looks from just being a little bit, maybe a little bit too thin, to someone who looks like she can probably handle herself, you know, in a gym, right? So make sure you kind of really pay close attention to these areas here, right? And naturally, straight away, as you can tell the difference between, especially on the character on the right, is that, right? Simply by adding a bit of taper and arranging the knees properly, we go from something like this, a little bit too stiff, to something that's much more reasonable, right? Same goes for the back view. Really, once again, the essence is about understanding this displacement between the lower and upper legs in a standing position. And then it works in every view, right? We can do it in every single view. This is kind of a fixed result I had created slightly more recently. As you can see, right? These are some of the mistakes that have been fixed compared to before, especially on the character on the left here. Look at this, really lack of taper, lack of displacement. Lots of things are missing, but with a bit of correction, right? The knee being, the upper and lower leg being in this sort of displacement, it's going to allow for this part of the knee to appear when looking, when looking from the back view. So All these are important aspects that I've talked about today. That's about it for this chapter. Thank you so much once again for joining me here, and I'll see you next time.